It's difficult to overstate just how fearsome the Assyrian Empire was. And despite a northern coalition joined by the Kingdom of Israel, the entire region would fall under the Syrian domination by 722. For his part, the southern Judean king Ahaz, wishing to basically be rid of his northern enemies, including his northern enemies Israel, and perhaps seeing the writing on the wall, there's no stopping the Assyrian army, Ahaz became a willing vassal of the Assyrian Tiglath-Pileser, all despite theological arguments to do the contrary by his court prophet. You may know him as Isaiah. Now, his son, Ahaz's son, Hezekiah, seems to have fallen a very different track, perhaps based on both the political realities of the time on the ground, but also, I suspect, out of his own theological convictions. Or to put it another way, his theological convictions might have been in a kind of dialectical relationship with his political concerns, which was the defense of the Judean state. Again, theology and politics at that time were simply inseparable, if they're ever really separable. Regardless, it appears that Hezekiah's Judean state absorbed a massive amount of population from the northern refugees. He oversaw significant state-building projects, especially those anticipating an eventual siege, specifically the construction of what is called the Broad Wall and the Siloam Tunnel for providing water for the rocky crag city that is Jerusalem. That tunnel, by the way, is still accessible, still gets water in it, and you can splash around in there if you like. We're also told of specific religious measures that Hezekiah took, perhaps at the behest of Yahweh partisans or Yahweh monolators, to destroy Yahweh shrines and to further centralize Yahweh worship in the Jerusalem temple. Such centralization had the dual effect of further unifying the political and theological registers of Judean society, and also, again, for providing a theological center in the eventuality of a siege that was coming. It was always in the cards. Now, biblical minimalists and maximalists debate about the exact nature and extent of these so-called reforms, or inquisition if you're a non-Yahwist, and little extra-biblical archaeology is forthcoming on the matter, though some scholars do point to an increasing anachonism in the seals or bullae of the period, but this could just be part of a shift from Assyrian influence to Egyptian cultural influence as the rebellion brewed. Now, Hezekiah was correct, and the siege did eventually come, mostly because the western region of the Assyrian Empire revolted under Egyptian encouragement. Sennacherib's early 8th century campaign in the Levant would see city after city fall. He impaled everyone in his path. The battle and fall of Lachish would prove to be made into art in his palace, providing us our best glimpse into the siege warfare of the time. And I have to say, there's something chilling about taking a stroll up the still existing siege ramp left by the Assyrians up to the walls of that city. Eventually, Sennacherib laid siege, or at least subjected Jerusalem to a kind of blockade of some kind, and biblical records have it that Hezekiah sought purely theological relief from the situation, with the Assyrian forces being tossed back after an angelic slaughter, and Hezekiah paying 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold to the Assyrians, stripping even the temple of gold and silver to pay the price. The Assyrians, for their part, record that after having Hezekiah pinned up like a bird in a cage, a higher payment of tribute was paid to the Assyrians, declaring that the terrifying splendor of the army brought the matter all to a swift conclusion. Now, I suspect that the truth probably splits the difference of these narratives. Hezekiah did pay hefty tribute to avoid a nightmare of a siege, and Sennacherib was probably happy to avoid an assault on a basically well-stocked, walled mountain fortress, which also now had a semi-secret underground supply of water, especially with the Egyptians at his back. Judea remained a vassal, something that the biblical narratives just happily don't mention. They really like to preserve Hezekiah, but they remained a vassal. Jerusalem, however, was at least saved, and it's very difficult to imagine, again, given the unity of politics and religion at this time, that such a miracle, I mean, it's literally described by the Judeans as an angelic army routing the terrestrial forces of the Assyrian army, that the religious measures that strengthen Yahweh worship at this time, clearly at the expense of other deities, that all must have paid off. It must have been the case that the Yahweh monolators were like, told you so. Now this victory must have been a positive boom for the Yahweh partisans, and perhaps they enjoyed, throughout the reign of Hezekiah, increased state-backed popularity through this time. And I don't think anyone can deny military victories, especially surprising military reverses, they put wind in the sails of theological visions. However, while a theological siege mentality might have worked well for a siege, it wasn't really going to function for the general prosperity of the regime in general. And it appears that incorporating elements of astral worship in deference of their position as Assyrian vassals, but also having a more theologically ecumenical position with non-Yahweh worship in the Jerusalem temple and beyond at the Beimot, was just much more likely to solicit wider popular support for the regime, supporting the booming olive oil trade in the region, and appeasing their Assyrian overlords. And the longest reigning Judean monarch and son of Hezekiah, Manasseh, did just those things. And it's best to consider that the Yahweh partisans, while again still not monotheists as we would recognize them, if at all, were likely thought of as extremist iconoclasts by the general population, for whom Asherah and other gods were very popular, and the nation around them. Their glee in smashing ancient popular cult sites might have inspired the same horror that we experience when the Taliban destroys those great Buddha statues, or Daesh or ISIS destroys all kinds of sites in the ancient Near East that they deemed idolatrous. The literature that has come down to us in the biblical text only tells one story, edited from the position of those Yahweh partisans and later Yahweh partisans editing their ideas into the text, and even Yahweh's triumphalism. But there's still good reason to think that such positions weren't popular, much less representative of the religious sentiments of the general population.